Hello and welcome to This Week in British History with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell from British History Tours. If you like British history, then you are definitely in the right place. So each week I take you through a roundup of events which happened in the week in history. So this week I'm going to be covering some of the events which happened between the 29th of March and the 5th of April. They include a fair smattering of Tudor things, we have some inventions in here. There's quite a lot in this week, so let's get started. I'm recording this in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, so we are all on lockdown. And so in addition to these weekly videos, I'm also doing currently daily virtual tours of historical sites and museums which are obviously closed at the moment, even if we could get out and see them. So that's a mixture of showing you what resources are available to you to virtually explore these places for yourself, and other videos, some of which that I had recorded in the past, so actually from those locations. So please do check those out. I'll put a link to the playlist here of virtual tours because you may enjoy those while we're all currently on lockdown. And anyway, regardless, they're a great resource for you if you love British history. So there's these weekly, there's daily virtual tours, but you can also pop along to my Instagram account, British_history_tours, as well for some daily images and photographs of some of our fantastic historical places. In a previous episode, I covered a little bit about Halleys Comet, and it is in this week that is believed to have been the first sighting of Halleys Comet in 240 BC. Obviously at that time it wasn't known as Halleys Comet because it was quite a few years before he was born, quite a few centuries before he was born, and and obviously we name it after him. So if you want to know more about Halley and his comet, then please do check out this video. On the 1st of April 1918, we have the amalgamation of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Navy Air Service to form the Royal Air Force, which is the third of our military arms. We have the British Army, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force now. Incredibly, it was only 7 years since in April 1911 the Wright brothers had their first successful flight of a heavier than air aircraft. But of course we'd had World War I, and the innovations which came with that in terms of aircraft and aircraft capability were massive. The requirement for an air force was unquestionable. On the 2nd of April 1502, Prince Arthur, Prince of Wales, died at Ludlow Castle. Now, Prince Arthur was the eldest son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He was heir to the throne. Prince of Wales is the title given to the heir to the throne in England, and he had been married 5 months earlier to Catherine of Aragon. Most people nowadays know about Arthur. His story was kind of squashed underneath the story of his younger brother Henry VIII, but his death is obviously hugely significant in the fact that we ended up with Henry VIII as king and not Arthur. So Arthur died, like I say, 2nd of April 1502 at Ludlow Castle, and he was there with his new wife Catherine of Aragon. They had been married about 5 months. Both of them became extremely ill. Catherine survived, Arthur didn't. And there's a number of conjectures, theories as to his cause of death, ranging from consumption, which is tuberculosis, to the plague, to testicular cancer. Obviously, being 500 years hence, we're not ever going to really know the cause of his death, but it was tragic. It was a big blow for the Tudor newly established Tudor dynasty. I call it a dynasty, but we were on our first Tudor monarch at this time. It was a blow for the country, who were craving stability after the Wars of the Roses had gone on for so long. It was a personal tragedy, obviously, for Henry VII, Elizabeth and Elizabeth of York, and they're known to have openly wept and had to console each other. Elizabeth reassuring her husband that they could have more children, or notwithstanding the fact that they'd lost a dear son, but they were left with one son, which was Henry. And in the time that they were in terms of the political stability of the country, but also infant mortality, it was worrying if you only had one heir, one son. Obviously, if you were the king, this was even more important. And Elizabeth did fall pregnant again, and I covered her the result of that pregnancy in a previous video, which I'll put the link up to up here too. Unfortunately, Elizabeth died as a result of the complications of the birth of the subsequent child. As Prince of Wales, Arthur was based at Ludlow Castle, which is on the border of Wales and England, as you can imagine. A very tough posting, because the Welsh lords and the English ruling powers, there was obviously conflict there. It was almost like a baptism of fire in terms of how to be a diplomat, how to keep the peace in such a turbulent place. When Arthur died, his body was embalmed and his heart was buried in St Lawrence's Church in Ludlow. He was laid in state until the 23rd of April, after which his body was processed down to Worcester Cathedral, where he was buried on the 25th of April. Arthur's tomb at Worcester Cathedral is well worth a visit, and I will show you some pictures of it now. You may notice a resemblance between this tomb and the Henry VII chapel, which was built onto Westminster Abbey by Henry VII, and that is because they follow the same design. Arthur's tomb is absolutely covered in heraldry. It makes for a beautiful tomb to look at, but there was obviously messages here. You know, this was a royal. He was the Prince of Wales. He was a Tudor, and these were the rightful heirs, kings of England. There were messages everywhere in Tudor. In Tudor ceremony, in any occasion, whether it be sad or happy, the Tudors used, as their forebears did as well, but they used it particularly well, heraldry and art, and they were very, very good at propaganda, I suppose we would call it. And Arthur's tomb is propaganda in stone. You have Tudor roses, both at portcullis, the feathers of the Prince of Wales, amongst lots of other badges on there. Now you'll notice some damage if you go and visit Arthur's tomb. Now that actually was inflicted during the Reformation, which happened under Edward VI, so that would be Arthur's nephew. Arthur's tomb was also visited by Elizabeth I, so if you go and see his tomb, you're treading in her footsteps. And what I love most out of all the flamboyance and elegance of this tomb is actually the step up into it. And I notice on Instagram and Facebook, people do take pictures of this step, the dip in this stone step, which is just a direct link to everyone who has ever stepped up into that tomb, and the thousands and thousands of feet that have crossed that step, all making their little mark into it. On the 2nd of April 1978, the patent for a innovation in fastenings which we all know, so don't pretend you're not interested. It ran out. Now, by this point, this type of fastening was already known by its brand name, Velcro. And hold on to the end of this segment to find out where the word Velcro actually comes from. Velcro basically works by imitating nature. You know, the seed burrs that get stuck on the dog's fur when you're out for a walk. Well, they were noticed by a Swiss inventor called George de Mestral. I hope I've pronounced that right. He took a burr and looked at it underneath a microscope and realised that the fastenings, the way it fastened onto the dog's fur was by a series of tiny, tiny little hooks. Along with some friends who were from the weaving industry, they managed to duplicate this occurrence in nature as a fabric. And as promised, the word Velcro, it comes from two French words, the word for velvet, velour, and hook, crochet, Velcro. On the 3rd of April 1721, Sir Robert Walpole became what we now term the Prime Minister, although at the time that wasn't a term that was used. And the reason this story is interesting, or at least interesting to me, is that he is the link to number 10 Downing Street being the residence of our Prime Minister.
Good evening, everybody. So you join me at Horse Guards Parade Ground off Whitehall. Now it is going dusk here, but if you can see to the right of the building with all the scaffolding on, that's the back of Downing Street. And I find it curious that the Prime Minister of our country lives effectively on a side street, Downing Street. But I thought it might be of interest to you to find out a little bit more about Downing Street. Downing Street, so that area that we're looking at over there, was Crown land, and on the restoration of Charles II, there was a guy called George Downing. Now he'd been on the parliamentarian side, but he successfully changed sides, like many people did manage to do actually, and he persuaded Charles II to rent him the land there on Downing Street. Downing built 15 townhouses on that boggy, waterlogged ground over there. And he built these 15 townhouses with no foundations, sat back and enjoyed the rent from them. So not the most scrupulous man history has ever known. But anyway, so it's his name that gives that is given to the street. But the land remained in Crown hands, and under George II, so it was 1732, George II, he wanted to gift Downing Street, or at least 10 Downing Street. I'm not sure what happened to the rest of the street actually, but he wanted to gift 10 Downing Street to his First Lord of the Treasury, a guy called Robert Walpole. Robert Walpole said, yes, okay, I'll accept, but on two conditions. One, that I accept it on behalf of the nation, not as a personal gain, and two, that I'm allowed to make it bigger. So, one thing for him, one thing for the nation. That's fair enough, isn't it? So he was First Lord of the Treasury. We didn't have Prime Minister. Prime Minister wasn't a term that we used at the time, and which is why the letterbox on 10 Downing Street says First Lord of the Treasury, and still does to this day. So he had the building was the house was enlarged backwards, which is why it comes quite a long way back onto here, and he could have had a much grander entrance onto Downing Street in where I'm stood now on Horse Guards Parade, but he decided that he would prefer a more discreet entrance off Downing Street, which is why we still have that entrance now, which, with the amount of security that's required these days, perhaps has ended up being the best thing. So that is why Downing Street, where our Prime Minister lives on Downing Street, effectively on a side street in London.
And another story relating to a British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill resigned for the final time as British Prime Minister on the 5th of April 1955. And in the show notes, I've put a link to a show reel of that story. On the 4th of April 1581, the rather controversial figure of Francis Drake became Sir Francis Drake, having been knighted by Queen Elizabeth I aboard his ship the Golden Hind while it was docked at Deptford. Drake was a controversial figure. Yes, he was an explorer, a navigator, a competent sailor, but he was also could be described as a privateer. He profited from his explorations personally. He dealt in slaves, but Elizabeth was grateful to him because he was the bugbear of the Spanish. He really was getting under their skin. He was taking their treasure. He was taking their ships and causing them a headache. And in Elizabeth's eyes, that was always going to be a good thing. Thank you for watching this episode of This Week in British History. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been a nice diversion from the events that are happening in the world right now. It's a bit of fun and hopefully informative as well, and that you have enjoyed it. If you are well, stay well. If you are poorly at the moment, then my best wishes to you for a speedy recovery, and I will see you all next week. Bye.